what's the hubbub? There's a corner of the internet that wants to believe everything happening with Paramount buying Warner Bros. Is somehow tied to restoring Zack Snyder's version of the DC Extended Universe. If you believe Paramount buying Warner Bros. Means Zack Snyder is about to return to DC and restore the SnyderVerse, there is a major problem with that theory. Well, besides HBO Max's Lanterns recently being a critically acclaimed breakout success helping the DCU, the road from a Paramount-Warner Bros. Deal to Zack Snyder running DC again is much, much harder than it looks. And two developments make that reality especially important: the brave and the bold continuing to face delays, and Snyder himself still facing a distribution problem with his completed movie, The Last Photograph. Neither development proves Snyder is finished with DC, but neither provides the evidence that SnyderVerse channels seem to think they do.
Is the SnyderVerse restored? It's coming.
We know the drill. Paramount buys Warner Bros., James Gunn is out, Zack Snyder comes back, Justice League 2 and Justice League 3 get announced. Gal Gadot leaves her husband for a Restore the Snyderverse channel owner operating from his mom's basement, who is somehow trying to fit a queen-size bed into the corner.
What is happening to my life?
Darkseid finally gets his day, looking like PlayStation 3 cutscene graphics for the win, and somewhere, a giant Restore the Snyderverse banner drops from the ceiling. Reality check. The actual Hollywood business is considerably less cinematic. Paramount buying Warner Bros. Would not automatically put Zack Snyder in charge of DC. In fact, the antitrust fight surrounding the transaction could make that possibility even more complicated. The first problem: Paramount may not be allowed to fully merge Warner Bros. The biggest issue facing Paramount isn't Zack Snyder, it's the government. The proposed acquisition faces antitrust scrutiny, with regulators examining whether combining two major entertainment companies could substantially reduce competition. That creates the possibility of structural concessions. One potential solution is that Paramount could own Warner Bros. Without completely absorbing its operations into Paramount's existing studio structure. In practical terms, Paramount could become the corporate owner while Warner Bros. Continues operating with a significant degree of independence. Warner Bros. Could retain its own leadership, its own production operations, its own studio management, and potentially considerable independence from Paramount's existing movie operation. That distinction is crucial. Paramount could own Warner Bros. Without simply turning Warner Bros. Into one giant Paramount movie studio. And if regulators require some version of that structure, the idea that Paramount could simply walk in and completely reorganize DC overnight becomes much less straightforward. Why this makes Snyder's return so difficult? Think about what Zack Snyder takes over DC would actually require. It isn't simply a matter of Paramount executives deciding they like Man of Steel and giving Snyder a phone call. DC already has an established creative structure. James Gunn and Peter Safran have been building a new DC universe. Projects have been announced. Actors have been cast. Stories are being developed. The company has already spent considerable time and money moving away from the previous DC continuity. Reversing that strategy would mean undoing years of planning. Paramount would have to decide whether to abandon the current DC universe, revive the old continuity, run both simultaneously, or create some completely different compromise. And if Warner Bros. Is required to remain independently managed, Paramount may not even have the freedom to treat DC like a department that it can completely reorganize overnight. That's a very different scenario from the fantasy of Paramount buying Warner Bros. On Monday and handing Zack Snyder the keys to DC on Tuesday. Then there's the brave and the bold. This is where things get particularly interesting. The brave and the bold has faced delays, and some SnyderVerse fans have interpreted that as evidence that James Gunn's DC universe is falling apart. But that's another leap.
And that is the article, ladies and gents. Yeah, we all want to just chuck up the deuces to James Gunn and Peter Safran. See you later. Good night, sir. It was nice to have you while we didn't enjoy any of it. Listen, I'm ready, bro. Let's come on. It's officially Monday now. Hopefully something happens. Hopefully they come to a deal so this can start we can start seeing more light. Like I told you, I'm seeing the light slowly at the end of the tunnel. I
A
am.
delayed Brave and the Bold does not mean James Gunn is out. It does not mean Zack Snyder is returning. And it certainly does not mean Justice League 2 and Justice League 3 are secretly being prepared. There are plenty of reasons a major superhero movie can take longer to reach production. But the Paramount-Warner Bros. Situation creates another obvious possibility. Why rush major DC decisions while the corporate future of Warner Bros. Remains uncertain? The Brave and the Bold isn't a disposable project. It is supposed to establish the DC Universe's Batman and introduce the Bruce Wayne-Damian Wayne relationship. That's a major piece of the DC strategy. If Warner Bros. Is potentially changing ownership, there is a perfectly logical reason to take time before committing to an enormous Batman production. And that actually makes the delay interesting for a completely different reason. It could demonstrate that the studio is willing to wait for clarity rather than immediately make irreversible decisions. That's very different from evidence of a SnyderVerse restoration. The SnyderVerse theory repeatedly makes the same mistake, taking uncertainty and turning it into confirmation. Brave and the Bold is delayed. Snyder is coming back. Paramount wants Warner Bros. Snyder is coming back. Warner Bros. Faces corporate uncertainty. Snyder is coming back. But uncertainty isn't confirmation. A delayed Batman movie is not a SnyderVerse announcement. A corporate acquisition is not a SnyderVerse announcement. And regulatory concessions aren't a SnyderVerse announcement. Snyder has his own immediate problem. This is where the last photograph becomes relevant. Zack Snyder has completed the movie, yet reports indicate that the film is still without distribution. That is a surprisingly important piece of context. The movie isn't an abandoned idea sitting in a notebook. It's a completed film that still needs a US distributor. Reports that potential buyers have concerns about taking on the movie demonstrate the difference between fan enthusiasm and Hollywood's business decisions. The SnyderVerse has an extremely vocal online fan base. The movement has generated petitions, campaigns, social media trends, and enormous discussion. But studios don't make decisions simply because an online community is loud. They have to determine whether a project makes financial and strategic sense. If Snyder is currently having difficulty getting a completed film into the US marketplace, that doesn't mean his career is over. It doesn't mean he can't eventually find a distributor. It doesn't mean he can't direct another major franchise. And it certainly doesn't mean Snyder is incapable of returning to DC someday. But it does provide an important reality check against the idea that major Hollywood companies are obviously lining up to hand him control of one of the industry's biggest superhero franchises. If anything, the last photograph demonstrates why the business side of this conversation matters. A passionate fan base does not automatically translate into a studio greenlight, and a completed movie does not automatically guarantee distribution. So why would a corporate acquisition automatically guarantee Snyder a new DC universe? It wouldn't. The antitrust question gets even more interesting. Now we get to the actual Paramount-Warner Bros. Transaction. The deal faces serious regulatory questions. Under Section 7 of the Clayton Act, regulators can challenge an acquisition when it may substantially lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly. And the concern here is obvious.
So basically speaking here, Section 7 of the Clayton Act says one person cannot buy another company and another company cannot buy another company if the effect of them buying that company or buying the shares of that company creates less competition. That is the basis of the law that the attorneys general of all those states are suing Paramount under.
Paramount and Warner Bros. Are both major Hollywood studios. Combine them, and you create an enormous entertainment company with major movie, television, streaming, and intellectual property assets.
And it was in this case that the Supreme Court, with precedents, set what the actual threshold is that would lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly. And that number, the Supreme Court said, is 30%.
That's why simply saying Paramount will promise not to abuse its power may not be enough. Regulators can demand structural changes, and that's where the separately managed Warner Bros. Idea becomes so important. Instead of Paramount completely absorbing Warner Bros., The government could insist that Warner Bros. Remain operationally distinct. That would allow Paramount to own the company while preserving Warner Bros. As a meaningful operation. It's an unusual arrangement, but it may be the kind of compromise that gives Paramount a better chance of getting the transaction across the finish line. The nuclear option: sell off major Warner Bros. Assets. If that isn't enough, Paramount could face an even more painful solution. Sell pieces of Warner Bros. To other companies. DC Studios could potentially be separated. Harry Potter could potentially be sold or spun off. CNN could potentially find another owner. Other major assets could also be put on the table, and companies such as Amazon or Apple could theoretically become buyers. The logic would be straightforward. If Paramount acquiring everything creates too much concentration, don't let Paramount keep everything. Turn some of those assets into competitors instead, and that creates an especially funny possibility for SnyderVerse fans. Imagine Paramount announces, to satisfy antitrust regulators, we are selling DC Studios, the Internet. We are discussing the Clayton Act, the Internet. Release the Snyder Cut. Unfortunately, the Clayton Act does not contain a SnyderVerse exemption. The great irony: this is where the whole situation becomes ironic. Some SnyderVerse fans are looking at Paramount buying Warner Bros. As though the acquisition itself is the solution. But the exact opposite could happen. The stronger the antitrust concerns become, the more concessions Paramount may have to make. Warner Bros. Could remain independently managed. DC could potentially be separated. Other valuable franchises could be sold. Paramount could end up owning Warner Bros. While having significantly less freedom to restructure it than fans imagine. So Paramount could become Warner Bros.' new parent company without becoming the studio's all-powerful creative ruler. And that makes Zack Snyder's path back to running DC even more difficult. Paramount cannot simply become the SnyderVerse savior. The biggest misconception is treating corporate ownership as though it automatically determines creative leadership. It doesn't. Paramount could own Warner Bros. Warner Bros. Could remain separately managed. DC could remain under its current leadership. DC could potentially be sold to another company. And even if Paramount ultimately had complete authority over DC, it would still have to decide whether bringing Snyder back made financial and strategic sense. That's a lot of hurdles. Meanwhile, Snyder still has to solve the much more immediate problem of getting the last photograph into the US marketplace. And The Brave and the Bold remains another reminder that delays and uncertainty don't automatically point towards Snyder. The road from Paramount buys Warner Bros. To Zack Snyder is running DC again isn't really a road, it's an obstacle course. And it may have more obstacles than a Justice League movie has theatrical cuts. What could actually happen? The most plausible outcome may ultimately be far less dramatic than the SnyderVerse restoration fantasy. Paramount buys Warner Bros. Warner Bros. Remains separately managed. Its movie studio maintains its own leadership and operations. Paramount receives ownership and whatever financial benefits regulators permit. DC continues along its existing creative path unless Paramount eventually decides that changing course makes business sense. It doesn't give YouTube channels another thumbnail with Zack Snyder, Henry Cavill, and Darkseid photoshopped together. But it is considerably closer to how Hollywood actually works. The real story isn't that Paramount buying Warner Bros. Means Zack Snyder is coming back. The real story is that the more complicated the acquisition becomes, the less reasonable it is to assume that anyone knows what the future of DC will look like. And until the ownership, regulatory, and creative questions are actually settled, declaring the Snyderverse's return is less a prediction than a fan theory. With that, it's today's hubbub. Please hit the like button and subscribe, as well as share my channel. To those who like discussing DC updates and healthy debates, welcomed. No SnyderVerse, no problem. Take care of yourselves and others.
I need you.